Welcome, everyone, to Health Humanities Grand Rounds. This is a speaker series organized in the HIVE lab in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at UNC-Chapel Hill. And my name is Kim Weed. I'm a teaching professor in the department's, the co-director with an incredible colleague, Jane Threlkill, of the lab, and our range of programs in undergraduate and graduate education related to health humanities. And before I turn things over to Jane to begin our talk and introduce our speakers today, I just have a handful of logistics to cover with everyone. The first is that we ask that you meaning the audience, keep your microphones muted throughout this talk today. It'll just help cut down on distractions. You are, of course, welcome to turn on your camera and give our speakers an audience. For the Q&A for today, I will monitor the chat, but after the talk is officially done, if you have a question that you'd like to voice yourself, you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and I will call on you to relay your question directly to our speakers. Otherwise, you can type a question into the chat, and I will relay that to them at the end. So I think that's all that I have to share with you at this point. So I will hand things over to my colleague, Jane Threlkill, who is here to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everybody. It is lovely to be a part of this strange Zoom atmosphere because as people are coming through the waiting room, I get to see their names. And each time I think, oh, yay, there's another wonderful friend or colleague. So here we are. I am so delighted to introduce Cindy Weinstein and Dr. Bruce Miller. Cindy Weinstein attended college in Massachusetts at the Good Liberal Arts Institution, Brandeis University, before making her way to California for grad school. She stayed in California, making a career as an English professor at a university known for turning out top science students, Caltech. At Caltech, she has anchored a small and vital group of scholars working in literary studies. I know Cindy as a fellow traveler in 19th century US literature, a reader of Hawthorne and Melville, Stowe and Dickinson. She's an astute reader of textual aesthetics in relation to the economic underpinnings of American culture. Her analysis of time and temporality in American novels reveal the unhinging of linear understandings of past, present, and future, evident in moments of grief, historical strife, or psychological extremity. Today, we gather to hear about a new kind of project that Cindy has recently completed with her colleague, Bruce Miller. It falls under the interdisciplinary umbrella of health humanities. This project, I want to suggest, picking up on the words of Cindy herself, is a project that hinges on the word both. It treats literature and also neuroscience. She draws on her expertise and her personal experience. She brings an analytical eye and is aware of the emotional textures of what she explores. And what she is exploring is her experience of her father's encounter with early onset Alzheimer's disease. Just a few quotations from Cindy's and Bruce's amazing book. Now I get to do both, Cindy writes. This book brings together both, and by both I mean many things. The both of 1985, which is when her father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and she was in grad school, and 2018, when she began this project. The both of me, Cindy, and Bruce. The both of literature and neurology. The both of my healthy father and my sick father. It's just beautiful, this knitting together of different fields of study, different ways of understanding the world. She has partnered with Dr. Bruce Miller, who is director of Memory and Aging at the University of California, San Francisco. I love that it's both Caltech and it's UCSF. I want to really recommend Dr. Miller's moving and precise commentary about studying behavioral neurobiology with Dr. Frank Benson. It was so refreshing to hear someone working in the scientific venue with such passion and beautiful articulation talk about his mentor and the passion that his mentor brought to his studies. This is what I want to give as a very brief quote from Dr. Miller's section of this wonderful book. "We are a social species," writes this neurologist. "Technology will never fully supplant our need to connect, our need to tell and listen to stories, and to reflect upon the meaning of those stories. That is who we are." So with no further ado, I want to say thank you to these amazing scholars, practitioners, and turn the Zoom over to them.
What a gorgeous introduction. My God.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, from the bottom of my heart, and Bruce's too, I think. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm sure Bruce wants to extend his thanks as well. We're really honored to be presenting the book we wrote together to your group. It's exactly the audience we hope to reach. There are many audiences we hope to reach, but this is a really important one. So this is just the opening slide, expressing our gratitude to the Alzheimer's Association for helping to fund a lot of the outreach activities that we've done. ERMAC, who's been really helpful as well along the way. The Global Brain Health Institute, Bruce will talk about that a little bit more. And my daughter, Sarah, who helped with the slides. Next slide. So just a brief introduction, although Jane covered a lot of it. I grew up in Verona, New Jersey, and went to Brandeis, and then moved to Berkeley in 1982, where I finished my PhD. During that time, 7 years was pretty fast, but I graduated in '89, and then was very lucky to get the Caltech job. And perhaps even luckier, I got to study neurology with Bruce and his colleagues at UCSF in the Global Brain Health Institute program. And then these are just some of my book covers. Thought they were pretty. I especially like the volume A Question of Time and the Man Ray metronome. Next slide. Bruce?
Sorry. So honored to be with you. Special thanks to Kim and Jane for this opportunity. I'm from the Midwest. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. My mom and father met there. My mom was wanted to be a medical illustrator. She eventually became an artist and influenced me enormously. My father was an academic physician. So I ended up at the University of Wisconsin, where I was actually an English ed major. I had decided I wanted to teach high school if the revolution didn't come, and so I was very involved with anti-war protests and I think an unconventional start. I ended up falling in love with medicine after finishing my undergraduate degree. Love thinking about molecules. I'm one of the few people in the world. I had to go back and get a chemistry degree that truly loved studying organic chemistry. I ended up at UCLA, where I followed the man who became my mentor, Frank Benson, a very generous man. Frank was an unusual person. I think he contributed enormously to our understanding of the brain. He said about himself, I'm a searcher, not a researcher. So he had a very interesting way of thinking about things. I ended up coming to San Francisco in 1998, where I direct the Memory and Aging Center. We have about 350 people in it. And recently, the way I got to meet Cindy is I helped to develop a program based at Trinity College in Dublin, where I just was, and San Francisco, called the Global Brain Health Institute. It was funded by a man you've never heard of, because he didn't want you to know about him. He believed that giving should be silent. His name is Chuck Feeney. He was an Irish American who loved Dublin, who loved San Francisco. I think he put about $8 billion of the money that he raised into health equity, predominantly, also political equity. He helped make the peace in Ireland. Worked a lot with the Obama administration around Cuba. A remarkable man. And for his last $1 billion, he put funding into 8 different programs across the globe that are focused on equity, ranging from an Indigenous peoples program in Australia and New Zealand, program focused on racism in South Africa, and Columbia University. London School of Economics is part of this massive effort. And ours is the only one, GBHI, that is focused on the brain. And we made 2 or 3 decisions very early on about the kind of class that we wanted. We realized that although physicians and scientists have a lot to say about the brain and equity, our artists are probably better communicators of what we do. So we have health economists, artists ranging from bluegrass fiddlers all the way to brilliant writers like Cindy, who spend a year together virtually on Tuesdays, undertaking in a curriculum that is very multidisciplinary. And in this cohort of fellows, about 35 to 40 a year, I think we are putting out incredible leaders who will change a number of stories, including the brain. And I think there's no organ in the body that is more directly related to equity than the brain. And the equity story begins in utero. If you aren't treated fairly in utero because of nutrition or air pollution, it increases your vulnerability, your ability to deal with what is coming, which are a number of inequities related to the social determinants of health. And we're also learning that even in very early in life, if your brain is not treated properly, it increases the likelihood that you will develop diseases of aging like Alzheimer's. So thank you.
I thought I would just briefly say, talk a little bit about the timeline, which Bruce alluded to a little bit just now. For many, many years, I wanted to write a memoir to honor my father. We were extremely close, and I wanted to write his story. I wanted to really get at a terrible synchronicity that happened when I was in graduate school. My father's initial presentation had to do with word finding. And when he couldn't find words, that's when I was becoming an expert in words. And so he couldn't read a book, and I was reading a book a day. And it was that simultaneity that gnawed on me for a very long time, and I wanted to understand it more, figure it out more. And I should also say, when my father was diagnosed in the 80s, everything was Alzheimer's. I'm going to show a slide from the book that points to sort of our much more sophisticated understanding of dementia now. But in those days, in the bad old days, everything was dementia. And one of the most moving experiences for me when I first met Bruce, I met him before the program started. But once the program started, we spent more time together, and we had a meeting, and he was asking me all about my father, and he said, Cindy, your father didn't have just Alzheimer's. He had early onset Alzheimer's. He was sick in his 50s, and early onset is 65 or younger. And this was the part that was really a revelatory for me, with the logopenic variant, which spoke to the word finding issue. And getting the diagnosis, even though my dad had died many years before that, was huge. And the first chapter of the book actually became a chapter on diagnosis. I didn't know I was going to write that chapter. And we can talk about that in the course of today's discussion. Just Bruce as the literary critic, talking to me about the narrative and the arc and how it wasn't sort of coming together in the way it needed to. I also wanted to write the book with a scientist. I was thinking a scientist. I was thinking Caltech, UCLA. There isn't that much research on dementia at Caltech. We're starting to work on Parkinson's in some of the biology labs. But I couldn't find anyone at Caltech. It took me a long time to get to Bruce. I talked to someone at Santa Barbara for a while who was very interested in what I was doing. He didn't have time. And all of our phone calls happened in airports when he was traveling from one exotic country to another. So I got that he didn't have time. And he said, you should really contact Bruce. And so I did about a year and a half before the program, GBHI, and we really hit it off. And he said the magic words, which were, do you want to learn some science? And I said, you bet. And he said, you need to apply to this program. And I did. And fortunately, I was accepted. And then spent the year studying neurology, going to classes twice a week, being taught by neurologists, geriatricians, economists, really getting a full view, I think, of different ways of thinking about neurology. And I read a ton. I'll show a slide with some of the memoirs that were really important in terms of figuring out what my voice should sound like. And then I drafted the chapters, and Bruce drafted some of his chapters, and he was able to complete his sections actually during the pandemic. Okay, next slide. I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Rita Sharon. I got to meet her, was inspired by her, and I just thought it would be good to have on the table just a quotation where she first talks about narrative medicine. And it's this passage: adopting methods such as close reading of literature and reflective writing allows narrative medicine to examine and illuminate four of medicine's central narrative situations: physician and patient, physician and self, physician and colleagues, and physicians in society. And Bruce was just sort of a miraculous person to do narrative medicine with, although I'm not sure we knew we were doing that at the time. But I do hope that this book gets read by doctors, because I think that the back and forth between me and Bruce could provide a template for doctors when interacting with patients and their families, And I think the power of storytelling is really evident throughout the book, whether it's our telling stories or me reading Melville telling stories. But I think if a doctor is willing to ask a patient and their family for a story before getting to the PET or the MRI, that could be really valuable. I think it gives the caregiver, the person with dementia, a sense of being listened to, and just some kind of agency, because I think the family is so frightened many times and so disempowered in the face of a really smart neurologist, that if the playing field can't be evened out, but if it can move in that direction, I think that could be really quite valuable. Next slide. And then I just thought that it was interesting. I've been thinking about this a little bit more, what the narrative components of dementia are. When I was writing the diagnosis chapter, Bruce kept asking me, what was the first symptom? And I understood why, because if you can get to the first symptom, you can get to where the brain is going wrong first, and potential interventions can be more effective. And I was able to tell Bruce that even though there was distance, and I think my mother would have a different version of the first symptom, but we went with mine. It was word finding. And it was really through Bruce's empathy and listening that I was able to remember that that was the first symptom. I should also add depression went along with it. And Bruce can talk a little bit if he wants about sort of the place of depression in terms of diagnosis of dementia. It's complicated. So on the one hand, there's this imperative, this desire to have a chronology and to have a point of origin for the disease. And yet the thing about grief is it goes all over the place. And I think it's in tension with chronology. And so in the book, I try and Bruce with me, tell a couple of different temporally oriented stories. One is a chronology of my father's dementia. And then the other one is a kind of anti-chronology of my grief. And what that looks like is my sections go back and forth in time, don't stick to the past tense. It's not a story of I was lost and now I'm found. I was sad and now I'm happy. It's way more complicated than that. And then I also begun to think about dementia as a disease that undoes narrative or calls into question our assumptions about narrative. And maybe that's why art and poetry are such powerful ways of telling the story of dementia. And I'm thinking a lot about surrealism at the moment and certain surrealistic art that I think does an incredible job representing dementia, thinking of Magritte and Dali in particular. Next slide. And here they are. This is on the left-hand side, Magritte. I think this is just such an amazing representation of word-finding difficulty. I don't think Magritte was thinking about that particularly. And then the Dali, the melting clocks, just sort of the temporal disorientation that often accompanies dementia. Next slide. And this is Emily Dickinson's famous poem, "The brain is wider than the sky." I won't read the whole thing. And then the next slide, there's another Emily Dickinson poem. "The brain within its groove runs evenly and true, but let a splinter swerve 'twere easier for you to put a current back when floods have slit the hills and scooped a turnpike for themselves and trodden out the mills." I love that. Let a splinter swerve. I read that and I see a cell going rogue. And Bruce has spoken quite eloquently about Dickinson as well. She is definitely a go-to poet for neurologists thinking about the brain. Next slide. So my goals, and I don't want to take too much time. I want Bruce to get in here. I wanted to have an interdisciplinary crossover. I wanted to write a memoir that would also give readers information about neurology. There was no way I was going to be able to do that. So I needed to find a neurologist who was also a really good writer and really empathic. And I found Bruce. I wanted to help others by making the science accessible, finding humor in the tragedy wherever possible, breaking down the stigma of dementia by sharing my story, and having Bruce in there giving readers state-of-the-art information about dementia. And in the course of it, I ended up recovering some of my own memories, which was not a goal, but ended up being a result. So these are some nice pictures of me and my dad. Next slide. Bruce?
Yeah, well, I have a tendency to say yes, particularly yes to people who really have a compelling story that they want to tell. My first goal was, meeting Cindy's demands, and I am, because I say yes to a lot, I'm pretty busy. And I honestly worried when we started this that I would disappoint her, that I wouldn't be able to put together the prose that really fit with the story that she wanted to tell. I've written a lot of books for people in my specialty about cognitive impairment. The disease I study is frontotemporal dementia, which is a very interesting dementia that bores in to the personality, empathy, executive function. It's a very interesting degenerative disease. So I wanted to reach a much broader audience with Cindy, and indeed we did. I love the opportunity to work with a great writer and think about my own writing and how that could communicate with more people. My teacher, Frank Benson, always said that you should be able to talk about science, however complicated it is, in a way that it is equally accessible to a lay audience as to a specialty audience. And I've shared that philosophy. And I think writing this book helped me to tell story to my patients in a much better way. I was really proud to be at the beginnings of dementia research with Frank Benson Cummings at UCLA. And I wanted to tell the story that they participated in changing the way we think about neurologic disease. This was, Cindy was a GBHI student for a year, so this was an opportunity to template the arts and the sciences together. I think physicians and healthcare providers too often forget that the relationship with the patient and the family is critically important. And if you misstep in the first minute of your interaction, I think you lose the ability to translate science and really help people. So those were some of the project goals. And somewhere in the middle of the year, I realized that we were going to, reach some of these goals. It was really thrilling for me. Next slide, please.
I've already alluded to some of these challenges. Finding Bruce took about 8 years, really in academic time. I'm not sure if that's fast or slow. Also figuring out the book structure. I really had it in my head that this was going to be a kind of call and response book, that I was going to write a section and then Bruce was going to respond to it. And what exactly that was going to look like, beyond that, I wasn't sure. once we had it down, I think it worked. And then it was a matter of convincing a publisher that it worked. And because it didn't really fit into a particular Amazon category, we had some challenges in terms of finding a publisher, and it took a little while, but we landed in exactly the right place, I think, which was Johns Hopkins. And it's still in a weird section on Amazon, like musculoskeletal diseases. I have no idea why it's there, but that's okay. And so those are some of the challenges we confronted in getting the book written and then getting it out into the world. Bruce? Me was next slide. So I just wanted to mention a few of the books that I found helpful. As Jane knows, you write a book, your tank is full, and then it gets empty, and then to write another book, you need to fill up the tank, and most of us fill it up with more books. So the other thing I did during my GBHI year was I just read everything I could get my hands on. And that included memoirs and Shakespeare and Wilkie Collins and just anything. But related to finding the right words, these were some of the books that made an impression, mostly The Year of Magical Thinking. Hemingway said, all American lit, starts with Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and he wished he could have written that one. Well, I wish I could have written Year of Magical Thinking. If you haven't read it, you really should. And then there were just some other memoirs that I found really interesting. Sue Miller, The Story of My Father, Gerda Saunders, Memory's Last Breath, and Eleanor Fuchs, Making an Exit. And that last one is especially interesting to me because her mother, Eleanor's mother, develops Alzheimer's. She didn't like her mother. And she tells the story of her mother changing as her mother developed dementia. And as that happened, Eleanor's relationship to her mother changed, and she started really liking her mother even more. And that hadn't occurred to me because I love my dad so much that that wasn't an obstacle. But then to think about a caregiver who then needs to care for someone with whom they had a really complicated relationship, it was good to read that story. It was really eye-opening. Next slide. Bruce?
Yeah. So challenge, in retrospect, it was almost, it was not a challenging year. It was really a delightful year, but I did need to find time to write. And I spent a lot of time writing in the morning, which is when I can really think clearly. Cindy pushed me to write more personally, which I eventually was able to do. I wrote a little bit about my parents and their influence on me. And also getting to know Jerry, who I never met. And Cindy wasn't with Jerry during a lot of his illness, but only through Cindy's filtered memories. So those were some of the challenges of the year, but not challenging in a negative way. It was delightful.
Thank you. Next slide. I want to make sure we have time to read a little bit from the book. So maybe we should, go through some of these slides a little more quickly. What I want to say is we included a bunch of figures in the book. They're in black and white in the book. On the book website, you can see them in color. It was very important to me and to Bruce to give readers images of dementia, and I'll show you in a minute. We have some images of the brain as well. I wanted readers to be empowered with language going into the doctor's office, and that if the doctor used words like Lewy body disease, they they may not know what it is, but they'll have heard that word. And primary progressive aphasia, these are all diseases under the umbrella of dementia. And as I said, when my father was diagnosed, everything was Alzheimer's. So this slide, which was done by Bruce's amazing colleague, Carolyn Priolo, explains to readers the many diseases that fall under the larger dementia umbrella. Next slide. Bruce, if you want to say anything about these slides, please feel free.
Well, one of the big stories that my teacher Frank taught me was that these diseases attack different parts of the brain and with very different functions. And so I think that if your degenerative disease begins in this tiny area called Broca's region in the dominant hemisphere, or the left hemisphere for most of us, you start with a disorder of speech. And so I think that the process of making a diagnosis for me is hearing people's stories, hearing what the first symptom was. I collect a bio-narrative. What is the person like before the illness? What are the first symptoms and what part of the brain do they come from? And one thing I never would have guessed when I started training with Frank and Jeff in the early 1980s was that where the disease starts tells us what molecule is responsible for the illness and ultimately is leading us to early interventions and therapies that yesterday, we have the first real therapy for Alzheimer's disease. Is it a cure? No. But this is really, I think, the beginning of the end for these neurodegenerative diseases. So diagnosis based on anatomy is really at the core of our field right now.
Next slide. I don't know, Bruce, if you want to say anything about the different aphasias.
Well, just very simply, this sort of exemplifies that principle. So if you start in the anterior temporal lobe, you lose what English majors and writers adore, which is words and knowledge about those words. And, this is a very specific type of progressive language disorder or aphasia with its own causes. Similarly, if you start with a non-fluent language disorder, like you see in the second image, you start, this is caused by a protein called tau. And then we've learned that if your problem is in the parietal and posterior temporal lobe, which you see in the third brain, the likelihood is very high that you suffer from Alzheimer's disease. So this is, some of the plumbing, the way we think about this and teach people about the proper diagnosis.
Great. Next slide. Yeah, so I want to move quickly through this. Just a couple of things that I learned studying neurology for a year, which is not enough time, really, except you can pick up some really great words and you can learn a bunch of things like the prodromal stage when the disease is percolating, and my father had hearing and sleeping problems. The disease takes usually a long time to present itself. It's kind of lurking. And so that was useful to know, that mood and depression are not necessarily reactions to the disease, but the disease itself. That medication is necessary, but some of the hardcore medication that my father was on was not helpful. I learned about the brain-body connection, the importance of cognitive reserve. And all this is to say, just getting the empowering effect of this information and this language and wanting to share it with readers in the book. Next slide. So this is the table of contents for the book. Diagnosis, word finding, space, behavior, and memory. And then Bruce and I are just going to read a little bit from the book, if that's okay. Next slide. And you can read along with. So this is from the word finding chapter. It was a beautiful spring day in Berkeley, and that evening we were going to make dinner at my house. Dad wanted a salad with his chicken. This seemed like a rather straightforward proposition until we got closer to the market, and Dad realized he wanted something very specific in his salad, but couldn't remember what it was. I was always good with words, having been trained in the arts of playing Scrabble at a very young age with a very competitive mother, and then spending hours on the New York Times crossword puzzle as a college student pre-Google. I was therefore confident that I could help Dad get to the right word with little fuss. Cocky, rational me went into problem-solving mode. Initially, I thought he wanted a certain kind of lettuce and not just iceberg. We were in Berkeley after all, and Dad had succumbed to the charms of the gourmet ghetto with its gorgeous produce and cheese varieties. Arugula, no. Red leaf, no. He made it clear that it wasn't lettuce that he wanted, but it was something in the salad. Goat cheese, no. Tomatoes, no. Chickpeas, no. Sprouts, no. I was starting to get a little antsy myself as I realized I wasn't hitting my mark. Dad picked up his pace as if speed would help him find the word more quickly, as if the word were running away from him and walking faster would help him catch it. I suggested that we might be able to figure out what it was that he wanted once we got to the market and we could go through the aisles. For some reason, I was set on the idea that it was chickpeas that he wanted, but he just wasn't connecting the word to the thing. Thus, I gently directed us toward the beans. Bad move. He got angry, not only because he didn't want chickpeas, but also because he realized that I was behaving as if I thought he didn't know what the word chickpea referred to. He was right to be angry, and I was right to treat him like a child, because he was one, sort of. I now see his anger as a good thing. He was angry that I was treating him like a child, and he was healthy enough to know it. As the disease progressed, I came to miss that anger because it had confirmed for me that some structures remained in place. He was still my father and I his child. Absent the anger, that was gone. He was gone too, and so was I. Next slide. I regrouped us and we walked toward the produce aisle. He told me it wasn't anything like that, as in nothing refrigerated. What the fuck was it? Capers? I didn't think he liked capers, but the past was pretty irrelevant, as I also thought he knew the woman to whom he'd been married for over 30 years. At a certain point, my dad's desperation became my own. No longer were we walking through the various aisles, which was another one of my initial strategies. Saunter through the aisle and maybe he'll see what he wants and that will be that. Considering other things we might have wanted with dinner. It was all about finding whatever it was that we were looking for, our white whale. Who knew it was croutons? The two of us began a frantic search through the aisles. With fear and hope, I watched my dad looking at the various cans and boxes of stuff on the shelves, his expression turning from hope to disappointment to sadness and back again with each swift rejection of not seeing the thing he could not name. I decided it would be worse for me to keep guessing, so I shut my mouth and just kept him company on his heartbreaking journey through the supermarket. Eventually, we found the croutons. Dad's face lit up. He was so incredibly happy. I could have cried for joy myself. It was over. The relief was physical. Our hunt through the oceans of salad paraphernalia was over. We could go home, make the damn salad, and eat. Until my dad decided that he wanted to rent a movie. I'll cut to the chase and tell you it was Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but my dad couldn't find the words, and so we started all over again. And then Bruce responds to that story. Bruce?
Yeah, a crouton is a small square-shaped piece of fried bread that is placed into soups or salads. The crouton originated in France in the 1800s, where a rich and complex food culture was emerging and humans were creating a new way of cooking and eating. Croutons are an acquired taste, rarely appreciated by young children. I'm surrounded by grandchildren, so this is something I think about. But by early adulthood, many of us begin to enjoy the aesthetic of eating a soft and chewy green salad with dressing that is dotted with hard and crunchy croutons. The actual origin of crouton is from the Latin word croute, which signifies crust, As is often the case with the English language, simply following phonetic rules does not help us to spell crouton. Rather, we associate an orthograph, the written constellation of letters, with the meaning of the word, which allows us to remember the correct pronunciation. Most of us infrequently eat, speak about, or write the word crouton. It is a word that is used with low frequency by most people, unless, of course, we are cooks and place croutons in salads every day, or fanatically eat salads with croutons on a daily basis, which I almost do. Ordinarily, words that we use frequently, like mother, father, shirt, cup, table, or house, are more facilely produced than a word like crouton. Therefore, it is not surprising that Jerry Weinstein, as part of his inability to name items, in neurology we call this anomia, had difficulty generating crouton during a conversation with his daughter. Jerry's struggle to remember crouton is the first moment that Cindy becomes aware that he is having cognitive issues. Anomia is one of the earliest manifestations of Jerry's Alzheimer's disease. Soon afterwards, Cindy realized that there are other signs of trouble. Jerry was never much of a reader, but now his spelling is off and his writing is shaky. How disturbing for Cindy, a voracious reader, writer, and emerging literary critic, to see her father struggle to name, spell, or write. A steady cascade of losses soon follows, and like many, Cindy watches her beloved parent descend into the dementia of Alzheimer's disease.
So that gives you a sense of the book and the back and forth in the book. There's a glossary with definitions of the scientific terms that Bruce provides. The glossary also includes some Yiddish terms that I include in my sections, as well as some definitions of literary critical terms. Next page, I think this is the last slide. Yeah. So I hope we've left enough time for questions, but Bruce and I would love to hear your questions and do our best to answer them.
Thank you. So yes, folks, please feel free to type questions into the chat or use the Zoom raise hand feature, and I can call on you to field your question.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Jane, yeah, kick us off.
And I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay, just very briefly, Cindy. I've not yet finished the book. Thus far, I don't have a vivid sense of whether you think your father would appreciate the book itself. Might reflect on that. Perhaps you do later in the book.
So I'll give away the ending of the book. The last chapter is on memory, and I thought that was going to be the first chapter because when I started the program, I thought all Alzheimer's was about memory, but it's so much more complicated than that. And truth be told, that was the hardest chapter for Bruce to write. So I think he was holding off on the memory chapter as well. But once it was written, we could have figured out where to put it. Didn't have to be at the end. But what happened is, in the course of I think I say this sentence directly, but in the course of looking at the hardest things about my father's illness, I was able to get over the wall of the illness and get to my healthy father. And so the last chapter it's a kind of, I'm embarrassed to say what I was thinking of when I wrote it. I was thinking of like Homer and Whitman and just sort of a catalog, like in Homer, there's the catalog of ships, and in Leaves of Grass, there's the catalog of everything he sees and all the people. And it was like this cascade of memories of my healthy father that I describe at the end. And so I think my father, one, would have wanted to help people in whatever way he could. And I think he would be glad that this book is out in the world, because I think readers are finding it helpful. And I think, he loved me so much. I think he would have been really happy that I was able to remember all of the silly, happy, ridiculous things that I talk about in that last chapter. So I think he would be really, really happy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Cindy and Bruce, it looks like Mary Elizabeth, one of our undergraduate students, has a question for you. So Mary Elizabeth, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I absolutely love what you and Bruce have written. I haven't read it, but like the first thing that really came to mind when you were talking about just communication with your father, it reminds me of my grandma. She has a stroke, and so her communication is limited. And so I was wondering, two questions really. Were there ever times in which you wished you could hear your father in the way that he talked, with the way you grew up? And do you think that your understanding of your father grew over time?
First, I'm really sorry about your grandmother. I wrote letters to my dad, and I have letters from him to me. Those are precious, and some of them are in the book. And so I have his voice in letters. That said, I wish I had a recording, but I don't. And so that was the first part. Remind me what the second part of your question was.
My second question was, do you think your understanding of your father grew over time, like sort of like how to communicate? Because
Yeah.
I don't know, I think that's something that I relate to.
I don't know. He was sick in the 80s where caregiving was just not even a part of the conversation. My mother was very worried that he would have taken his own life if he had the diagnosis. And so and this was very difficult, we were asked not to tell him. And so I think part of the grief that I have is not having had those conversations. And maybe that's a romantic notion, like that, oh, if we'd had them, like I would know, or if we'd had them, he would have been able to articulate, what was going on. But I guess, the honest answer to your really good question, Mary, is no. I don't think that's the right answer, but that's the truthful one. And I think if anything, a lot of the learning that happened was I learned what was going on with my dad's brain. So that was really valuable. And then I learned a lot about myself.
We have a few questions in the chat, so I'll begin with one from Isabella. She asks, you compared the process of grief to Alzheimer's earlier in the lecture. With your father's Alzheimer's, did you feel like you began to grieve your father's loss earlier than when he passed away, or did the grief come all after? And secondly, did you feel like the book was a way to gain some closure from the difficult loss you experienced?
So there's a term, anticipatory grief. I didn't know that term. I write a little bit in the book about trying to be intellectual about my grief, which was really stupid. I thought, okay, like I can't lose it if dad can't do X, because when he can't do Y, like then what? And instead of, I think, grieving along the way, I contained it, I compartmentalized it, I really kind of anesthetized myself, and I would feel it late at night when I wasn't thinking about Melville or Theodore Dreiser or Emily Dickinson, when my brain was like turning off, then I would feel it. But then it was too scary. I compare it. It would have been like looking at the sun, going blind. And so the grief was just very weird and complicated and delayed. And it was with Bruce decades later that that I got to go through it all. And Bruce was just so patient and empathic and understanding that. And I write about this in the preface. When my dad died, we're Jewish, we sat Shiva, and I was just completely out of it. And it wasn't till like 25 years later that I sat Shiva a second time and did it with Bruce. I didn't know I was doing it. And I did it the way I needed to do it, by reading, by learning, by sitting, by remembering. So does that answer the question?
I think it absolutely does.
Could I make a quick comment on this? Maintaining the memory of your loved one, and it sort of taps into Hillary Nguyen's question as well. So,
yeah,
I've lost.
Hillary's right here.
Oh, great.
I'm watching her. Yeah.
So, Derek Parfit, a great philosopher from Oxford, 20th century, posed a paradigm, and I think it's really relevant to degenerative disease. And that was, if you're committed murder when you were 20 and you have rehabilitated yourself and your brain has changed and you are no longer the person who committed that murder, what is your responsibility at age 60 for that? With degenerative disease, it's exactly the opposite of that. We see a slow disintegration of, in the case of the disease I studied, frontotemporal dementia in particular, the personality, the morals, all of the things that make our loved ones particularly human. And I think I've noticed with my memories of people who I loved, who have passed, who suffered from disease, it seems like the bad crowds out the good, at least in my dreams. And, and I think this so dignified, this book, this incredible man who really had a strong moral force. There are a number of stories here that Sydney tells that really make you admire Jerry. You can see a man of enormous substance. And so I love that process that Cindy went through of dignifying and remembering but not ignoring the terrible devastation that happened to the brain as well.
Thank you, Bruce. And we're getting lots of really excellent questions in the chat. And Cindy just mentioned to me privately that it's okay if we go a little bit over time. So I'm going to roll with it for a little bit more, but I will reiterate some of them. But a lot of praise and thanks that are coming in these questions. But one that stands out at this point to me is from Jane Pryor. And after an effusive praise of your work, she asks about Bruce, with your knowledge as a neuroscience researcher, can you talk about what Cindy or any of us in a situation where we might have a loved one with dementia, what can we do or to behave, support, or otherwise communicate with our loved ones developing the disease? And advice on that front.
It's a wonderful question. In the book, for me, the saddest, I don't think for Cindy the saddest, but for me, the saddest anecdote that Cindy relayed was her father's group of male friends. And they golfed together. The camaraderie seemed like it was wonderful. And, he still enjoyed golf, even though, this disease was affecting his language and eventually his spatial abilities. And the group just disintegrated. all of a sudden this group was no one. And the men continued playing golf with each other without Jerry. And, to me, this is so sad. And, it talks about the stigma of dementia. We run from it when we see something different. The amount, to me, caregivers are an exalted status. And, the ones who do it brilliantly, their brains are changing as well, and they're developing their empathy circuits and learning to do things and teaching us as physicians how to do a better job in this caring process. So, I think empathy, time, understanding, these are, some of the core values that lead some people to be brilliant caregivers and others not. But it's something that we in the health field, as our nurses, our social workers, we see it, and wow, do we ever appreciate it. Just a quick comment about that. The first thing I do in my clinic, or very quickly when we're gathering the family together, is a lot of times the caregivers have been criticized by other members of the family. You aren't doing this right. You should see this other doctor. And, in the middle of somewhere that is, offering horrible quack therapies to people. But, the level of criticism is enormous. And the stress of this is enormous. And, Cindy and I talked a lot about this, what the illnesses that caregivers get. And so the first thing I do is I look the caregiver and the patient in the eye, and I say, you have faced a very difficult illness, and you have done a masterful job of dealing with it. And, I say this almost always, and it's almost always true. Yeah.
Thank you for that. There are two different folks in the chat who've asked a question about balance. So I'm going to try to combine them a little bit for you. Angela asks about how you went about balancing out humor and science while still managing to, keep the book informative, which seems to be one of the goals. And then Melissa Trostar asks, in kind of bringing together the scientific and the technical, how did you, with the personal, how did you strike that balance? So questions about balance in terms of humor and the science, or the more personal stories and the science.
Bruce, do you want me to take that?
Or do you want to maybe start, Cindy?
Sure. That's a hard question to answer. I knew humor was essential because, as we say in the preface, this is a very sad story, and I was worried all along that people would just close the book. And I'm sure that there are some people for whom, the book, they're not ready to read it, even with the humor. And really, you ask about the balance, the best way I can describe it, maybe Bruce, you can do better than I, is I just had memories emblazoned in my brain. And each chapter is basically organized around one or two memories that I have of my father's illness. And I wanted to do closer readings of my father's clinical presentations, and I wanted to do close readings of my close readings, because I knew that bringing my brain to a lot of what I was seeing was part of the problem. And what I really needed to do, and I did this in the chapter that was the hardest for me to write, which was the chapter on behavior. It's funny because I think that was probably the easiest chapter for Bruce to write, because frontotemporal dementia, I hope it's okay, I'm speaking for you, Bruce, but FTD, it really is so much about behavior. for me, I'm not sure there's anything funny in that chapter, because writing that chapter was a constant reminder of my decision to stay in Berkeley when my father was sick in Florida. My mother was the primary caregiver. There were aspects of my father's behavior that were deeply unsettling for me, and I needed to write about that. I needed to share that. I'm not doing a very good job answering your question because I don't have that much balance in my life, to be perfectly honest. So Bruce, can you help us out here?
Well, I'm looking at Melissa Truster's question. It's really a sophisticated question, and I think it really captures this process, as do the other questions related to this. And for me, it was really probably belongs on the slide about challenges, because this is Cindy's story and it's Jerry's story. It isn't, I'm there to help explain it. But and Cindy kept pushing me. I think you need more personal anecdote in your drafts. And so I'm a little shy and I was uneasy about that. But eventually I told some very personal things about my parents, in part because I think it made my section, more readable to people. It made them, understand the science process enormously. And one of the most fascinating things that happened to me in terms of balancing in this and this push and tug and pull was writing the memory chapter, where I realized that the metaphors that we have in science for explaining memory are inadequate, because we really don't understand autobiography at all. I mean, I think we fake it, but the language is off and the science isn't really there because no one has really studied it. So I sort of started to integrate biography as well into the memory section, which I thought was very interesting. But I think Cindy and I really did, do this constant integration, balancing, changing. She said something mean about Florida. I said, take that out. You don't need to say anything bad about Florida. It had some bad memories for her. But, this was, truly, around the humor, around all aspects of it. It was really, for me, an exhilarating group kind of process.
Bruce thought we might have a lot of readers in Florida, so he didn't want me to alienate anybody.
Probably wise. And Bruce, I actually have a follow-up to this balance question related to the phrase that you use, which is bio-narrative.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about, so far we've been talking about how you balanced the personal with the science in the book, but I'm wondering in your clinical practice, because when, in our health humanities courses, when we talk about things like narrative medicine, I hear a lot from students, well, how can a clinician have the time to ask questions and listen to a story? And it seems like for you, the narrative is central to your clinical reasoning and process of diagnosis. So I would just really like to hear more about how you compose a bio-narrative with a patient, especially keeping in mind that the demand on time that seems to be one of the, rate limiting steps for enacting more narrative medicine practices.
So I'm an incredibly impractical person when it comes to how I spend my time in clinic. And very early, I decided I wanted to do it the way I wanted to and figured out ways of paying for it and other things, because I was phenomenally curious. And frontotemporal dementia is a disease that if you don't know who that person was before the illness set in, you will never properly make a diagnosis. So in frontotemporal dementia, if your disease begins with loss of empathy for people, I can tell you with almost, very high certainty that the right anterior temporal lobe is the site of the degeneration, and that I can even go down to the type of molecule responsible for this. But you have to know what the person was like. Were they always empathic, or maybe they were born unempathic? And so this process of teasing out very specific parts of a person's history where something was different is for me the key to the diagnosis. And I think I think more and more as we, develop therapies, it's increasingly clear that we have to do this right. We have to treat families and people with these illnesses properly. And, if we get the wrong story in the medical chart or the wrong diagnosis, it's truly a catastrophe. But the other part that I love so much is just learning about these people and their stories. And I think ultimately it saves time because it makes it easier for them to listen and, think with me about how to solve a problem. And there's a lot more to the impractical aspect of it, how I support this effort. But, this is how we run our Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. Yeah.
Well, I so appreciate just the generosity of time that you've offered and staying over. And there are more questions, and Cindy has been very generous to offer folks, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can email her directly. But I think one to end on appropriately is to ask each of you about one of the biggest lessons that you took away from this process of working together and working across disciplines, because in many ways, this really is an interdisciplinary project. So any final thoughts about that?
I guess what I would say is a couple things. For me to do the kind of interdisciplinary work I wanted to do in order to tell the story of my father, I wanted to find, and was so lucky to find, an expert in the field who was as committed as I was to explaining complicated ideas. For me, was with respect to literature, really, but who could explain really complicated science to readers in a way they would understand. And also to do this work, to find someone who was as passionate as I was about the story, which is amazing as I say it, because Bruce didn't know my dad except for what I told him about my dad. But someone is passionate to tell the story and then to continue telling it. So the book came out a year ago, and Bruce has just been by my side every step of the way. There are a lot of audiences for this book, and Bruce has just been my partner in the outreach aspect of the book. Not everyone has access to UCSF, and so I just feel so lucky that Bruce has been willing to give himself to readers who can't get to UCSF. So the equity piece of it that drives GBHI, I think, is also very present in everything we've done since the book came out.
Well, I mean, I would say one of the things, I mean, what a wonderful audience. The questions are as good as we've ever gotten. I just am very grateful to all of you. I mean, this is one of the things, unexpected pathways that happens when you say yes to something that's out of your, ordinary comfort zone. And for me, that was a wonderful aspect about this whole process is saying yes to something, honestly, I didn't think I could quite do properly. And it changed my brain. And I think it prepared me for new adventures. So this is, for me, saying yes was maybe the big lesson. And, I just had a really good feeling about Cindy when we first met, even though she didn't like my favorite English book. And I didn't think she liked The Doors. There were some things that really put me, in worrying, but it all worked out incredible.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
It was about pension.
Oh,
Oh,
pension,
that's what
right.
it was. Yeah. Well, thank you to you both for being so generous with your time and speaking with us today, to everyone who attended. And what I'll do is I'll save the chat and send it to both of you so you have a record of some of the questions, and people really shared some beautiful stories about their own experience with dementia. So I want to make sure you got those from the folks in the room. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And especially thank you to Cindy and Bruce for this engaging talk. We really appreciate it.